I write this now with the hope that should anybody find this message, they take heed of the warning that I share here. I wish greatly that anything could be done about the horrid truth I have discovered, and I implore those much more knowledgeable than me to study the translated calculations and charts I have included, praying dearly that they discover some flaw in my mathematics, though I fear that they will not. I worry that my calculations alone will be disregarded as mere hogwash, so I am including here my story, so that one may believe me just that bit more. When my colleague from Lorik University approached me about the strange island he had come across in his travels, I found it quite difficult to believe that he was telling me anything but fairy tales. He insisted to me that all he said was true, that a hitherto yet uncharted island had served home to him for several months during his 6-month-long expedition into the Pacific Ocean. While his original intentions were to study and perhaps even educate the native population among the scarcely populated islands and atolls, his discovery of an island which held evidence of a truly advanced civilization, at least amidst the Bronze Age, yet no living members of the community immediately put his long-anticipated study on hold in order to record and chart the island and its artifacts. This discovery could have very well painted a new story for civilization within the Pacific Ocean, or at least he assured me so. Poring over his diagrams and samples, I concluded that if this was indeed true, our understanding of the islanders could change drastically overnight. But the details of the findings were quite perplexing and often nearly impossible to explain. My colleague had described a civilization of superior advancement upon this island, well within the Bronze Age, if we were to compare to similar technology within our own European history. However, the confounding part of the articles presented was that there is no ecological or geographical explanation for the invention and production of the tools and materials that were indeed produced on the island. In order for bronze to be created, there must be both copper and tin to be mined and smelted, but the geologic study queerly revealed no veins of either element. The acquisition of these elements or fully assembled products would have been otherwise impossible. Despite my better judgment, when he extended an invitation for me to accompany him upon a subsequent archaeological expedition to the island, I said yes. I had my reservations about his claims, and I realize now that I would have been far better to dismiss his stories as mere tales and left it at that. Nevertheless, a month later I found myself upon a steamship headed towards the South Pacific without my colleague. He had taken ill the day before we were to depart, and instead of the expedition being temporarily postponed for the following week, the university, funding the research and trip, insisted that we continue in spite of the lack of our lead researcher. Alas, 2 weeks after setting sail, we dropped anchor a mile off the coast of a densely canopied island. The trip itself was uneventful. The sea was calm and the skies clear, but on the 13th day, our captain informed me that we would be preparing to anchor within the next 18 hours. This confused me greatly. The telltale sign of land, birds, was absent, the sky a silent blue blanket. When I inquired about this anomaly to the captain, he quickly replied in a hushed, graveled voice, No birds, not here," and brushed me off. I was unable to get more information from him, despite the effort that I expended to pry whatever more that I could from his chapped and toothless mouth. I pondered as to how he knew that we were at the correct island. The Pacific is populated with many islands that look identical to the one at which we had moored, but as I stared at the island and examined it closer, I could see telltale signs that set it apart from all the others. Even from the deck of the ship, I could see a tall, black, megalithic structure standing just beyond the edge of the tree line and just above the tops of their canopies. The longer I peered into the thick jungle, the more of the precisely angular pillar I could discern, unnaturally high and perfectly peculiar among the otherwise serene Pacific Island woodland. And not long after dropping anchor, I was shorebound on a small wooden dinghy along with several members of the expedition team, spread out across several other dinghies. It was then that we spent the night setting up a small research outpost consisting of a central canvas lean-to and an inward-facing ring of tents for each of the members of the crew and research team in which to sleep. There were merely 43 of us to begin with, but by the time we had finished, our setup resembled more of that of a small colony than a camp. The sun had set not long after the last stake was planted, and the first of the lanterns were lit not too soon beyond that. It was, unfortunately, too dark for me to go and examine the gigantic monoliths I had seen from the ship, so I reluctantly retired to my cot that night and resolved to venture out at first light. That night I slept restlessly. I dreamt of a deep sea, its depths so black they appeared in shades of indigo and violet. Within the bottomless caverns and abysses into which I peered shone tiny reflections of white stars in the night sky, and as I sank deeper and deeper still into the all-encompassing deep, the sparkling images of the celestial bodies proved not reflections, but rather the direct light from the stars above me, for I was not descending into the unfathomable abyss, but rising towards the Father, to which it was a mere bastard, toward the utterly incomprehensible and inescapable void of the universe that encompassed all. Reflecting back, I know now that the rise from the surely suffocating ocean to the surface should have given me great comfort. Instead, the encroaching beacons above me offered naught but greater terror, and in that moment I wished for nothing more than to sink back below into the deep, the frigid darkness a refuge of warmth compared to what surely awaited me upon the surface. And yet, as I crested the surface of the waters, I found myself awake in front of the great monolith I had spied from the deck of the ship the day before. From the ship, it appeared no more than 100 feet high, but standing before it, I struggled to understand how I could have been so far from the truth. Nearly 300 feet tall and perfectly smooth, the obsidian structure cast no shadow. As I circled the monument, the exact nature of the tower made itself no more clear to me than it had been as it peeked shyly over the canopy of trees. Regardless the direction from which I studied it, the surface appeared infinitely concave, retreating without end into itself. From close enough I could see that there were edges to the shape, 3 of them. It was a triangular prism about 50 feet on each side. But as I inched closer and closer to these edges, they became bent inwards, sucked into the infinitely deep concavity that moved along with my sight. I'm unsure of how long I was mesmerized by the utterly entrancing nature of the surface of the black glass. Perhaps it was merely a window revealing what I could not understand, but when I was finally able to tear myself away from its intoxication, I discovered that I was in a nearly perfect octagonal clearing somewhere within the depths of the jungle of the island. It was nearly 100 feet from the corners of the monolith to its own, composed of bricks of some unfamiliar gray stone, perfectly carved as if they had just left the table of the mason, despite having been exposed to the elements for what could have been millennia. As I continued to explore my surroundings, I came across a path leading away from the obelisk. I traversed the road and was reminded of those built by the Romans, but even those had not held up nearly as well as this street. It consisted of the same unrecognizable gray stone that had made up the base of the monolith, each brick identical to the last, extending far past the horizon. Onward I went, becoming acutely aware that the only sound I could hear was the rapping of my boots against the smooth masonwork. There were no sounds of life, which I had expected, as the captain had mentioned the lack of birds as we approached, but even the sounds of rustling leaves and trees were queerly absent. The echoes of my boot soles reverberating from the dense woodland on either side of me were the only telltale signs that I had indeed awoken from the warm embrace of the dream of the deep. I could not gauge how long I traveled, but before long the sun began to hang low and red in the sky. It seemed that no matter how far I walked, that my immediate surroundings did not change. No, the megalithic obsidian prism seemed no further distant than when I had begun walking from it, for what seemed to me hours before. I began to think that perhaps I had not awoken from the dream. Instead, the walking I had done was merely the torturous wade through a dreamscape that is all too familiar in nightmares. It was no sooner than I entertained this line of thought that I came upon a small ridgeline with a set of stone stairs leading up over the top of the berm. I made confident strides, astonished that I had not seen the staircase from further away. Coming to the top, I discovered for myself that which had surely amazed my colleague. Ahead of me was a large village. No, it was more like a city, composed of various sizes of smooth, solid stone buildings. The stone was a deep red, almost as if the buildings had been painted in blood, and was like nothing I had ever seen. I began to walk the narrow streets, amazed by the density with which the houses were packed together. Adorning each doorway were immaculately polished bronze hinges and decorations. There were signs next to each threshold, engraved with angular lines and circles which I could only guess to be the writing of the civilization that had once occupied the island. Each intersection of roads were wide, containing numerous bronze torch posts, and although the torches were not lit, the wood itself was as if the trees used to fashion them were chopped down not but a day previously. I came upon a public square, and along the outside were rows of wood, fabric, and metal structures that resembled merchant stalls. Some were even stocked with goods such as food or weaponry. Whatever civilization had lived here, my colleague had not given even the slightest bit of hint that they were as advanced as this. Indeed, from what I have seen, the civilization I had stumbled upon mirrored seafaring, colonizing civilizations such as Greece or Rome during antiquity. I wonder now, perhaps, if he had not seen the same city that I had. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, lifting the shroud of daytime from the existence of further stars, I realized that I would not be able to do any proper exploration in the dark. So I took the fabric from several of the merchant stands, rough though it was, and inside one of the buildings surrounding the square, fashioned from it a bed. Outside, I once more heard not a peep, and I eventually fell into another restless sleep, lulled by the sound of my own heartbeat. Within my dream, I found myself again submerged within the violet deep. But I did not feel fear, as I had the night before. No, I felt tranquility, comfort, ease. It was a peace so deep that it felt one with the dark around me. I was acutely aware that I was indeed in a dream, and I hoped with all my soul that I would never awaken from the bliss I felt in that moment. But it was not meant to be. Soon I felt the light of not-so-distant stars upon my face, and the merciful dark was torn asunder by the malevolent shine of the dream invaders, turning my tranquil home into a night terror beyond expression. The stars above me shone brighter, searing their visage into my unclosing eyes, as more emerged from the boundless black abyss above me, promising to engulf the peaceful deep in burning, hateful flames. I awoke to the sun shining onto my face through a glass skylight, which I had not noticed in my haste to find shelter the evening prior. I paused momentarily as I awaited my heart to cease its attempt to forcefully remove itself from behind my ribcage. In the daylight, I could see that the room around me was just as red as the exterior of the building, empty, save for various small ceramic pots lining the walls at seemingly random intervals. Most of the vessels were bare, although some contained a white powder I ascertained to be wheat flour, which perplexed me, as there was no wheat growing anywhere on the island. I decided to grab one of the smaller empty pots and put some of the flour in it. I came up with a plan to use the flour as markings on the rough red stone so that I could follow my path back to where I had started, much like Hansel and Gretel. I left my temporary room after packing up my makeshift bedroll and walked out into the dense urban sprawl. Not having any driving force one way or another, I chose a direction at random and began to walk, marking my path at each intersection lest I get lost on my return. I passed through the narrow streets and alleyways in utter disbelief of the scale of the city. Indeed, my mental calculations seemed to suggest that the city itself was significantly larger than the rather small island that it inhabited. I soon found myself near the shoreline at the foot of a rather large set of stairs, which led upwards to a building of equal magnificence. While still composed of the solid red stone, the architecture was like none I had seen on the island or in my previous world travels. At first inspection, the building resembled that of a traditional Baroque European cathedral. complete with flying buttresses and tall pyramidal spires. But upon further scrutiny, the geometry of the building itself was far from what one might consider traditional. The features were mostly asymmetrical, widening and squeezing in smooth curves that drew the eye along them, flowing as would a natural river. The curves followed no discernible pattern, and each curve was dissimilar to the one directly opposite to it. The spires that topped each of the four pillars at the corners of the buildings were impressive and mighty, overshadowed only by the center spire that dwarfed them by nearly 40 yards. As I strained my neck to see the top, I felt almost as if each spire were shifting, twisting and distorting against the non-existent breeze. The angles of each minute detail of the structure were straight and true, but when examined with any deeper level of intensity than a mere glance soon broke one's inherent sense of dimensionality within our world. Yes, the spires and towers and buttresses and flowing curves of intricate carvings and reliefs that adorned each surface were difficult, if not impossible, to look at for longer than mere seconds, before the mind strained attempting to understand what it was seeing. The perfect right angles produced non-parallel lines. The base of each tower was composed of only 3 sides, yet connected with vertices of 90 degrees. The dissimilar curvatures of the detailing created impossibly small, yet still observable widths. Yet despite the mental anguish produced within me by these mathematics-defying features, I felt a strange compulsion to enter the building in front of me. I walked up the stairs as if in a trance and passed through the infinitely narrow doorway with astonishing ease. The interior of the building proved to be almost disappointing at first. Despite the harrowing architecture composing the outside, the inside was a simple rectangular room, much smaller than the exterior would suggest. Hanging from each of the 4 walls were large slates similar to what one would find in a university lecture hall, each covered in ornate white markings of the same strange language that adorned each house, and shelves of papers and writing implements stood tall in each of the corners. I remained within the building for an unknown amount of time, examining each board and scroll with an intensity I had not felt since drafting my thesis paper several years ago. I was determined to come away with some shred of understanding of the scrawled markings. It wasn't before long that the sun began to set on the horizon once again, so I resigned to sleep, for I rationalized that I could spend as much time as needed the next day to deciphering the writings that eluded my understanding. That night, I was welcomed once more into the abyssal deep. The cold of the indigo-black waters comforted me as I drifted aimlessly through the void. Nevertheless, the cruel tyrants of light returned, their hateful rays of light closer than the 2 nights before, so near that I could feel their heat upon my skin and the water boil around me. I raged against the unwelcome guests, screamed wordless screams as my water-filled lungs produced nary a sound, my anger shielding my fear behind a brittle facade, but the lights advanced ever closer until my mind was filled with brilliant white flame. I jolted upward, the screams from my dream finally producing sound as I awakened to the darkened room. I ran outside and grabbed a torch from one of the sconces, lit it, and looked at the puzzling calligraphy once more, confused no longer. I finally comprehended what it was that was so hidden from me the night before. Drawn upon each slate and paper were mathematical equations, charts of the night sky, a drawing of the strange monolith, and most curiously, a map of what I can only assume to be the Earth. However, it was composed of a single large continent, not the 7 that are known to exist. Struck with the epiphany as I was, I followed each and every formula, compared the star charts to what I knew to be true of the universe, and began to understand what was so beautifully written upon these boards, an understanding which was so far from beautiful. The odd symbols and equations on the slates began to paint quite the horrific picture as I made sense as to what it all meant. The distance of the stars to the celestial body that seemed the focus, the sun much too far away, the measurements adorning the almost artistic depictions of our universe mathematical, the calculations correct, but the numbers and conclusions they determined wrong, queerly far and mysteriously unfamiliar. They promised a shrinkage, no, a convergence, a hunting, a chase of our insignificant home, a sport of which our planet was the game. It seemed that whatever civilization left these ruins were the prey of something far, far greater than themselves, and the obelisk that entranced me so was their celestial beacon. I understand now the meaning of my dreams. I understand them far too well. As I write this, staring into the seemingly endless expanse of space, I'm terrified of just how frightfully close in the sky the stars are.